down, sit down. I heard good things. You built Carmine's Bronzeville book up. 100,000 a month. 100,000. Never took a dime from the top. A young man not tempted by foolish money. You seem to respect my policy on drugs. You know, the feds, they tolerate certain things. Not drugs. You make your crew understand they deal in drugs, that's all. They die.
Long before Albert Anastasia was butchered in a midtown barbershop, long before Frank Scalise was pushed aside, long before the gun was raised on Frank Costello, the real architecture of New York's underworld was already in place. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't loyal to one flag. It was layered. Men carried one foot in one family and the other somewhere else, depending on where the money was moving that week. That was the system Carlo Gambino inherited, exploited, and perfected. One of the men who embodied that system was Carmine Fatico, known on the street as Charlie Wagons. He was an old-timer by instinct and a modern operator by necessity. Fatico came up through the Anastasia crowd, deeply embedded in the gambling network, but his reach extended far beyond one crew or one boss. He was tied tightly to Tommy Lucchese and Frank Costello because Costello, more than anyone, understood gambling on a national scale. That was the connective tissue. Gambling linked the old guard to the new, the street to the politicians, the neighborhood to the airports. It was through men like Fatico that Carlo Gambino stayed connected to both the fading legends and the rising generation. These were the remnants of earlier syndicates, men who had touched the Dutch Schultz operation, who had been absorbed by Lucchese's machine, and who eventually fell under Gambino's umbrella. Fatico wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. He opened social clubs, built quiet alliances, and enforced discipline. He was also one of the men who helped shape the next era by teaching it, whether he intended to or not, to a young soldier named John Gotti. By 1966, Gambino had consolidated control of the family he took from Anastasia's corpse. He didn't just survive the transition. He dominated the other four families by staying patient while they fought themselves. That same year, Gotti was learning the trade under Fatico, one of Gambino's 24 capo regimes. Fatico was short, lean, and sharp. The nickname came from his specialty, truck hijackings. Anastasia had put him in charge of East New York years earlier, and Gambino had been smart enough to keep him there. From a modest storefront known simply as The Club, Fatico ran everything east of Brooklyn. Every morning, he held court in the back room, handing out work, settling disputes, and listening to men who needed favors. His crew numbered roughly 120 made men, soldiers, and associates. A capo wasn't just an organizer of crimes. He was a banker, an advisor, and a judge. Fatico understood that balance. He followed the rules that mattered most: absolute loyalty upward and relentless earning downward. His operation was estimated to gross around $30 million a year. He was also violent when violence was required. That talent mattered. In a Cosa Nostra family, the ability to kill efficiently, quietly, and without leaving a trail was still the most valuable currency of all. John Gotti didn't look like a future boss at first. Before joining Fatico's crew at 26, he was a drifter. He tried burglary and failed. He stole copper wire and got caught. He worked in a Brooklyn coat factory and walked away. Gambling only left him broke. Even marriage nearly collapsed before it started. He met Victoria Di Giorgio in 1960, got her pregnant, and within a year had a child and responsibilities he couldn't meet. By the mid-1960s, he had 4 children, style, swagger, and nothing steady to show for it. Fatico gave him chances anyway. Gotti blew burglaries, got arrested stealing an Avis rental car, and did 6 months for another attempt. While he was inside, his wife sued him for non-support, an embarrassment that cut deeper than the jail time. When he got out, Gotti went straight back to the club. Fatico surprised him by assigning him to hijackings at Kennedy International Airport. Gambino was expanding there as waterfront freight declined. It should have been an opportunity. Gotti failed again. He and his brother Gene pulled one clean job using forged airline documents at the United Airlines freight terminal. Instead of walking away, they repeated the same scheme at the same terminal and got arrested. Weeks later, Gotti, Gene, and Angelo Ruggiero were caught hijacking trucks on the New Jersey Turnpike. This time, there was no escape. They were convicted and sent to Lewisburg Federal Prison. Lewisburg wasn't punishment so much as preparation. Officially, it was run by wardens and guards. Unofficially, it was governed by mafiosi. The system worked for everyone. Riots were avoided. Order was maintained. And young inmates learned the rules from men who had written them. Gotti shared space with hundreds of mob figures, including Carmine Galante, the ruthless Bonanno boss, and Jimmy Hoffa, sent there by Bobby Kennedy's relentless pursuit. Informants later told the FBI Hoffa had discussed killing Kennedy while inside. Gotti absorbed everything. He impressed Galante enough to receive a job offer, but turned it down because his loyalty belonged to Fatico. Galante respected that. Gotti spent his time lifting weights, working minimal hours, and studying men who had survived long enough to matter. If the government had designed a school for organized crime, it couldn't have done better. Outside prison walls, law enforcement kept circling the same names. Raids hit private clubs. Men like Aniello Dellacroce, Joseph Gallo, Paul Castellano, and Carmine Fatico were swept up and released on bail. Newspapers tracked the spread of crime families into Long Island, policy banks handling tens of millions a year, labor unions under mob pressure, and gambling rings stitched together across boroughs and states. Fatico's name appeared again and again, linked to gambling, labor rackets, extortion, and murder plots. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His presence alone told investigators where power was flowing. This was the ecosystem Carlo Gambino controlled. Old soldiers, new blood, overlapping loyalties, and disciplined earners like Carmine Fatico forming the bridge between generations. From social clubs to airports to prisons, the family didn't just survive pressure, it adapted to it. And men like Fatico ensured that the next wave, including a failed hijacker named John Gotti, learned exactly how that system worked before they ever rose high enough to challenge it. By 1973, Carmine Fatico was no longer operating in the shadows. He didn't have to. The structure he helped build for Carlo Gambino had already settled into Suffolk County like permanent infrastructure, and everyone who mattered understood where authority flowed. When Suffolk District Attorney Patrick Aspland announced the breakup of another loan shark ring that March, the announcement wasn't a revelation. It was a confirmation. The man Aspland identified as the Suffolk kingpin of the Carlo Gambino crime family was Carmine Fatico, known on the street as Charlie Wagons. He was already out on $25,000 bail awaiting trial on a separate loan sharking indictment when detectives came to his house on Higby Lane in West Islip. This was not a fall from grace. It was continuity. Fatico had been here before, and everyone knew he would likely be here again. According to the investigation, Fatico wasn't just part of the operation. He was the money man, the one who decided who operated and who didn't. Without his approval, nothing opened. The ring had been working Western Suffolk, Babylon, and Huntington primarily, since early 1972, extending loans in the thousands to small business owners who needed cash fast. Bar owners, men already cornered. The interest rates told the rest of the story, up to, and sometimes exceeding, 260% annually. A $1,000 loan meant $50 a week in interest for as long as even a penny remained unpaid. Fatico wasn't collecting envelopes himself. He didn't need to. That work was delegated. Louis Babe Caputo, already out on bail for gambling charges, was identified as second in command and the man who applied pressure when pressure was required. William O'Gorman, a former bodyguard and chauffeur for a convicted murderer, and Jerry Cowan, Caputo's brother-in-law, handled the weekly collections. It was clean, efficient, and deliberately insulated. The arrests came quickly and quietly. Fatico and O'Gorman were taken at their homes. Cowan was picked up in Huntington. Caputo was arrested in Fort Salonga. All four were indicted by a Suffolk grand jury on 10 counts of criminal usury and 1 count of third-degree conspiracy. If convicted on all charges, each faced up to 41 years in prison. In custody, Fatico listed his occupation as an unemployed cook. No one in the investigation took that seriously. Law enforcement sources described him as the #1 Gambino figure in Suffolk County, the man who ran gambling and loan-sharking operations across the region, the man who had once been suspected of trying to take control of the local painters' union, the man whose approval determined whether an operation lived or died. Asplund declined to name the victims. Officially, it was to protect them from threats and intimidation between arrest and trial. Unofficially, everyone understood why silence mattered. Over the previous 4 years, Racket's investigations in Suffolk had led to 50 indictments across 13 separate loan shark operations. 15 defendants were already serving prison sentences. The machine kept grinding, but it never disappeared. Fatico's record stretched back to 1930. Bookmaking, assault, grand larceny, decades of arrests that never removed him from circulation for long. By the early 1970s, he was no longer just a capo running a Brooklyn storefront. He was the Gambino family's gatekeeper in Suffolk County, enforcing the same rule he always had: money flowed upward, discipline flowed downward, and nothing moved without permission. This was the mature phase of Carlo Gambino's empire. No chaos, no improvisation. Just men like Carmine Fatico doing what they had always done, quietly, methodically, and with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly where power lives. By the time Suffolk started putting Carmine, Charlie Wagons, Fatico's name in print, he wasn't a rumor anymore. He was a fixed point. You could find him the way you find a courthouse or a rail line, by following the traffic that kept showing up around the same addresses, the same clubs, the same faces. The papers described a man who lived like he was under siege and operated like he was never in danger. He had the West Islip House on Hageby Lane, the kind of place that didn't look like a headquarters until night came, and it lit up so hard the detectives compared it to Shea Stadium. 2 German shepherds at the edge of the property. Lookouts posted like it was a military perimeter. Men on rooftops, men spilling out from behind storefronts, men who appeared the second a stranger slowed down or a camera came out. Detectives told the story like it was a punchline, except they weren't laughing. One of them tried taking pictures, and a guy ran out of a candy store yelling that the police were photographing the place. Another time, a team watching him saw Fatico bolt from a club, trapped in the back of a panel truck sweating, lying flat on the floor while 2 burly men slammed the doors and drove off. It wasn't paranoia. It was procedure. And behind that procedure, police said, was an empire that stretched across Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk, loan sharking, hijacking, bookmaking, big enough to feed crews, settle debts, and keep the right people loyal. By then, investigators called him a captain in the Carlo Gambino crime family, and one of the 6 men who controlled illegal gambling on Long Island. He rarely handled the mechanics himself. That was the whole point of rank. He sat back and let the machinery run through others, insulated by distance, buffered by fear, and protected by the simple fact that nobody wanted to be the person who got too close. His headquarters wasn't a mansion or a flashy office. It was a storefront club in Ozone Park, the Bergen Hunt and Fish Social Club. Nondescript from the street, hardened inside like a bunker. A police informer who got inside said the first welcome wasn't a handshake, it was a frisk. He was forced to sit in the outer room like a man waiting for a judge. 3 or 4 card tables, a few chairs, a television bolted to the wall, an espresso pot, orange peels and cups left behind like evidence of men who didn't worry about leaving traces. Then a guarded door, and beyond it a windowless back room with a large round table. That was where the real room began. That was where Fatico sat. At the table, Fatico sits like a don and holds court, one detective said, and he didn't mean it as poetry. He meant it as logistics. People came to him the way they came to the parish priest, the way they came to the guy who could fix something that official life couldn't fix. Money, disputes, pressure, protection, permission. But Fatico didn't let his day get eaten by nobodies. He had a filter. His brother, Danny Wagons, was the wall. Police called Daniel a Gambino soldier, a feared presence, the man who made sure unimportant hoodlums didn't waste Charlie's time looking for favors. Even men who thought they were tough watched how they spoke when Danny was in the room. The club, detectives said, felt like a mirror of another place, Manhattan's Ravenite social club on Mulberry Street, where the ruler was Aniello Dellacroce, Fatico's close friend, the underboss the cops called O'Neill, and the newspapers treated like a ghost with a badge number. The same atmosphere, the same discipline, the same idea that the club wasn't recreation, it was government. Back in 1966 at the Ravenite, police had arrested Dellacroce, mob advisor Joseph N. Gallo, and other notable figures, calling it a major Cosa Nostra crime meeting. Those arrests didn't stop anything. They just showed who sat together when the doors were closed. Fatico's reputation, even from people paid to watch him, carried a grudging respect. No nonsense. Old school. The kind of man who demanded respect and got it, even from Danny, even from men who were used to taking what they wanted. When he's busted, he tries to act like a dummy with us, one intelligence agent said, but he's a shrewd old guy. The agent said he counted among his close friends Don Carlo Gambino and Aniello Dellacroce. And that wasn't name-dropping. It was the map. What made him more dangerous, the detective said, was that he didn't need to lean on violence first. He preferred diplomacy and strategy when it worked. That's how you hold territory without constant bloodletting. That's how you take over without looking like you took over. The Huntington area was a clean example. For years, the Bifulco family dominated gambling there. 2 decades of local control, operating independent of the mob by keeping their bookmaking tight, horse racing and numbers, staying away from the kind of action that forced you into the mob's infrastructure. They didn't need layoff centers if their bets didn't get too heavy. They didn't need a boss in Queens to balance their books if they never let the books get out of control. Then television changed the diet. Pro football, basketball, volume, bigger action, bigger swings. The Bifulcos took heavy sports bets and got in over their heads. That's when they needed layoffs. The pressure valve that lets bookmakers spread risk and avoid catastrophic losses. And that's where they ran into the real wall. Fatico controlled the Queen's layoff they turned to. They could stay independent until they needed the wider system. The minute they needed it, independence became a fairy tale. In December 1971, police said a new bookmaker appeared in Huntington, Louis Babe Caputo, sponsored by Fatico. Competition that wasn't really competition. It was a message delivered in numbers. The rivalry didn't last long. Racket squad detectives raided both rings. but not before the Bifulcos learned what it meant to be cut off. Police said Fatico shut the doors of the layoff centers. That's how you break a bookmaker without touching him. You don't have to shoot him. You just remove his oxygen. After that, investigators said Frederick Fritz Bifulco ended up reduced to a sheetwriter, a man recording telephone bets, working under a Fatico associate. The boss in Huntington wasn't the old family anymore. It was Fatico, through nominees, through men who carried his permission like a license. That was the model. Control the infrastructure, then control the neighborhood. Control the money routes, then the personalities don't matter. Loansharking worked the same way. In March 1973, Suffolk District Attorney Patrick Aspland announced the breakup of yet another loan shark ring, and the newspapers didn't describe it like a street crew being rolled up. They described it like a branch office being exposed. The man they identified as the Suffolk kingpin of the Gambino family was Carmine Fatico, arrested at his home at 810 Higby Lane, already out on $25,000 bail awaiting trial on a separate loan shark indictment. That detail mattered. It told you how durable he was. Even when the cuffs went on, he kept moving. The ring, Aspland's office charged, had been victimizing at least 10 people in Western Suffolk, primarily Babylon and Huntington, since early 1972. They loaned thousands and charged interest rates that weren't loans. They were sentences, up to, and sometimes more than, 260% a year. A $1,000 loan meant $50 a week in interest for as long as a penny remained unpaid. Not until half was paid. Not until most was paid. Until the last penny. That's how you keep someone working for you without calling it ownership. Aspland refused to name the victims. Officially, he said he wanted to protect them from threats and intimidation between then and trial. He declined to say who might make such threats, and he didn't have to. Sources close to the investigation said most of the victims were small bar owners, people desperate enough to take fast money and scared enough to keep paying. The sources described the hierarchy the way these things always run. Fatico was the boss, the money man. Caputo was second in command and believed to serve as the strong arm when necessary. William O'Gorman and Jerry Cowan made the weekly collections. The paperwork charged 10 counts of criminal usury and 1 count of third-degree conspiracy. The maximum exposure was brutal, up to 41 years if convicted on all counts. It sounded like the end of the story. But it wasn't. It never is. Fatico, when arrested, gave his occupation as an unemployed cook. That was part of the routine of acting small in front of the state, while living large behind locked doors. Investigators didn't treat him like a cook. They identified him as the #1 man in Suffolk for the Gambino family, the man who decided who could operate and who couldn't. Without his okay, you don't open up, one source said. They said he had been suspected of trying to take control of the local painters' union. They noted his history, convictions going back decades for bookmaking, assault, grand larceny. The pattern was consistent. Whenever organized money took root in Suffolk, his name floated near the surface like oil. Even with those arrests, detectives admitted the business kept flourishing. By late 1973, knowledgeable police estimated his loan shark and gambling interests grossed around $30 million a year and continued to operate from new locations. He couldn't be reached for comment, but police said he was overheard telling friends he was disgusted by what he viewed as Suffolk harassment and talked about leaving West Islip because these damned farmers won't leave you alone. That line said more about him than the charges ever could. He didn't see himself as a criminal under siege. He saw himself as a businessman being inconvenienced by locals who didn't understand the rules. And in his private life, he performed the old world code like it was a uniform. Simple tastes, they said. No flamboyance, no neon ego. Yet he wore $100 alligator shoes and silk suits. His home looked unpretentious from the outside, and expensive inside, furnished tastefully, the way a man does when he wants comfort but hates attention. They called him a family man, a grandfather, expecting his people to gather for dinner on Sundays and holidays. He roasted associates who were too flashy. He admonished men who didn't take care of their families while running around with girlfriends. He liked the horse races, and police tracked him to Roosevelt Raceway, where he entered through the Horseman Owners Members Gate, despite not being listed as an owner or a member. He moved like a man who didn't ask permission, because he was used to being the one who gave it. Years later, the net tightened in a different way, not through a single indictment, but through supervision that turned mob routine into parole violations. In the late 1970s, federal authorities made a point of watching career criminals the way you watch men who refuse to stop living, as if they own the streets. A specialized intensive supervision unit was created in 1977 to monitor organized crime figures on parole or probation, and their power was simple. They could show up anywhere, at any hour, and if you were where you weren't supposed to be, you were back inside. By October 1978, Fatico was sentenced to 5 years probation in a federal conspiracy case. Law enforcement sources said that by the early 1980s, he was a virtual prisoner within his own home. He was barred from visiting the Ozone Park social club that had functioned as his throne room. When probation officers observed him entering it anyway, he was reprimanded and warned he'd be jailed if he violated the ban again. The only criminal he was allowed to see was his brother, Daniel. That detail matters because it shows what the system recognized. Fatico wasn't dangerous because he ran his own hands. He was dangerous because of who gathered around him. Stop the gatherings and you starve the machine. But even that close watch didn't erase what he had already done. Fatico had given John Gotti his start. As a teenager, Gotti ran with Fatico's gang, and, through Fatico, was introduced to Aniello Dellacroce, the mentor who would become the spine of Gotti's rise. When Fatico was tied up by investigations, Dellacroce named him head of the Bergen gang, and when Gotti went away for cargo theft and hijackings between 1969 and 1972, Newsday reported that Fatico moved the gang's club from East New York to the Ozone Park storefront that would become the epicenter of that crew's next phase. This is how the Gambino family worked at the ground level. One man builds the room, another man builds the next generation inside it. The clubs were classrooms. The older captains didn't need speeches. They needed habits, discipline, secrecy, loyalty, and a sense of hierarchy so natural it felt like weather. Fatico didn't just collect money, he enforced a way of living. In the end, the public record never fully matched the private certainty investigators carried. He was twice indicted on loansharking charges and never convicted because witnesses contradicted or recanted grand jury testimony. He was convicted later in a hijacking case with his brother in the late 1970s involving stolen furs taken from Kennedy Airport. That case produced something bigger than a sentence. The Fatico hearing, a federal ruling that out-of-court statements by an unidentified informer could be used for sentencing in certain circumstances without violating due process or confrontation. Even in the courtroom, his name became a tool. Another piece of the system reshaped around the kind of man he represented. By 1991, cancer finished what prosecutors and detectives never could. Carmine Fatico died at Good Samaritan Hospital in West Islip at 81, survived by his wife Rose, stepchildren, and grandchildren. His stepdaughter described him simply as a businessman, a great person, loved by his family. His attorney called him a salesman and a painting contractor, a private man who went to church and kept to his house. The funeral was held at Our Lady of Lourdes Roman Catholic Church, burial at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village. And yet the portrait drawn over the years remained consistent because it came from too many angles to dismiss. A 5'4" captain who held court behind guarded doors, protected by a palace guard, anchored to Dellacroce, close enough to Gambino that insiders spoke of him as family, not merely crew. A man who took a local gambling kingdom by controlling the layoff centers it needed to survive. A man who turned desperate bar owners into weekly payments with interest rates designed to last forever. A man who lived behind floodlights and dogs and lookouts and still went to the track like he belonged there. A dying breed, a detective called him, and the admiration wasn't for the crimes. It was for the style, polite, disciplined, controlled, the same old-world surface that made the machine look almost reasonable until you did the math and saw what it cost the people underneath it.